Aside from pure curiosity, the point of measuring a mouthpiece is generally to compare the playing characteristics of two or more mouthpieces. So the point of the mouthpiece is to make music, and we're never going to replace playing the mouthpiece to actually try it out. But the more measurements we take, the more data points we'll get that'll give us a good idea of how those mouthpieces play and hopefully find the right fit for you. So as a quick disclaimer, what we are getting is data points. And so that's going to be a single measurement of a single point on one mouthpiece. And in some cases, that's going to be easy to compare across mouthpieces. And in other instances, not easy at all, as we'll go into a little bit more later. But what this will give us is, again, some points of comparison that can help us say, okay, this mouthpiece is the same or different in this way, but we won't get a complete picture of how that mouthpiece might play until you try it out. So depending on the playing characteristic you're interested in, we're going to want to measure different parts of the mouthpiece. So for instance, the rim shape, the cup diameter, the cup shape or depth, the throat, the backbore, or the overall mass of the mouthpiece and where that's placed. So each different part of the mouthpiece is going to have a different way of measuring it that'll make it more useful in terms of giving us good information. And sometimes that'll require some special equipment if you want to get a really accurate measurement, like a micrometer or a bore sizer, but a lot of them will actually just require some kind of creative thinking to find out what you're really trying to measure, and you can use household items to actually get good information. So the throat is a good place to start because it's an easily definable place on the mouthpiece. It's the narrowest point at the base of the cup and in between that and the backbore. So this can have an effect on playing in the sense of how much back pressure the player experiences because you're trying to fit your airstream through that narrowest point. It also can affect tone and pitch. The most accurate way to measure the throat of the mouthpiece is to use a bore sizer and a micrometer. And those are very specific tools that'll help us do that. The first thing we want to do is put the bore sizer through the throat of the mouthpiece. Then expand it until you can't fit it through the throat, so it's too big. Then, using really small adjustments, make it slightly smaller until you can just barely get it through the throat of the mouthpiece. Once you get it out, measure that diameter with the micrometer. So because what we're trying to find is the narrowest point in the mouthpiece, any object that'll let you know what that smallest point is will be helpful. So for instance, if you roll up a sheet of paper and keep that consistent relative to where that narrowest point is, that can be there. Standalone bore tools, which are available, which are basically a very specific cone size that have lines on it showing where you put it in and where it stops, that's the throat. Also using an object like a wooden coffee stirrer that's fairly rigid but will compress when you put it in can let you know where that point is and let you compare it to another mouthpiece. The next element of the mouthpiece is the rim shape and the cup diameter. And a lot of times this is actually the measurement players are most interested in because it's the point of contact with the player and it's where we're most sensitive to it. Most players have an established idea of the diameter that they feel is comfortable. And that's okay, but there's actually a wide range within that we might think is okay based on a measurement. The other thing is this can have a pretty large effect on flexibility, tone, and just overall feel and endurance when you're playing. One of the reasons it's difficult to compare rim shapes and cup diameters using measurements is because rim shapes can be really, really different in terms of the inner edge and how that connects to the actual cup of the mouthpiece. Finding the exact same place on that complex curve can be really complicated. So even if we agree on that point in space, once we try and measure it, the rim shape and where we're used to feeling that might be different. One of the best ways to compare rim shape and cup diameter is actually to just play the mouthpiece and feel it and actually visually inspect it. If you don't have the mouthpiece, there are lots of tables online that'll let you find out the actual measurements the manufacturers use, and almost all of those will give some sort of comparison, so even if it's not an exact comparison in terms of measurement, it'll let you know a similar size to what you're playing. Another way to actually compare that is to use simple artist putty, and it's available for about 99 cents if you go to any art store. And what you can do is just make a quick impression of the cup of both mouthpieces, and that'll let you at least inspect the same idea in a different perspective. To continue our disclaimer process, This won't give you an exact measurement of something that is exactly the same or exactly different, but it will give you a pretty good idea of what you can compare between those two mouthpieces and how that might affect something you like about their playing. Cup shape and depth actually have some of the widest variance within any kind of mouthpiece design. And you have different things like how wide it is. It's an even larger space with that complex curve we talked about from rim shape and cup diameter. So a lot of manufacturers will give a description of the inside of the mouthpiece using terms like deep versus shallow, wide versus narrow, or bowl versus V-shape. In a lot of ways, those descriptions can actually be the most helpful because it lets you know how it compares to other things within that manufacturer's line and the mouthpiece you currently play on. In terms of comparing it and actually measuring it, again, because it's a complex curve, we're not going to be able to find a ton of really useful measurements in terms of micrometers. However, what we can use is other simple household methods like we described with the cup diameter and rim shape. For instance, the putty method will let you see what that looks like at different points where you might not be able to see it as well in the reflective metal. The other thing is blowing through the mouthpiece will actually give you an idea of how it's channeling the air and the sound. Another simple way to check the depth of a mouthpiece is to use any kind of household object that you can put into the cup safely and will stop in a consistent point that you can then measure later. For instance, using a pencil, if you put it in until it stops in the throat, then put a mark on the pencil where it actually stopped at the rim, then compare that to another similar mouthpiece and see if it's the same depth or different. Another way you can check the overall volume of a cup of a mouthpiece is actually just to fill it with water. If you block off safely in a way that you can then take off later, the throat of the mouthpiece, filling it one drop at a time will let you know how many drops of water fill up a mouthpiece before it spills over. Comparing that with another mouthpiece will let you know its overall volume. The backbore is actually the most difficult to measure part of the mouthpiece because it's the least accessible. The backbore has the same kind of complex curves as everything else on the mouthpiece, but it's less accessible because it's inside the shank. If we want to find a specific measurement, we can use the bore sizer again, set it to a specific depth within the backbore, and then measure that using the micrometer. In addition to being a complex curve, the backbore is generally combined with the rest of the mouthpiece to gain certain playing characteristics. Denis Wick has three kinds of backbores: a V-shaped backbore, a barrel backbore, and a combined backbore. They each have different playing characteristics that match with the rest of the mouthpiece, and other manufacturers tend to think of the backbore in the same way, as a contour that matches the rest of the overall parts. The overall mass of a mouthpiece and where it's placed can have a profound effect on how a mouthpiece plays. The easiest way to check this is often through a simple visual check. Between a heritage mouthpiece and a classic mouthpiece, we can see that the mass is in a very different place within the overall blank. Between a heavy top or ultra mouthpiece and its normal weight counterpart, we can see that there is more overall mass. For finding out the overall mass of mouthpieces that aren't as similar, there are some simple household ways that we can use to find out that comparison. First, a kitchen scale is actually a very great device to use for that. Most of them are highly accurate, and comparing the mouthpieces using that will give you a clear idea. Another simple way to find out the mass of a mouthpiece is to use water displacement. If you have a graduated measuring cup at home, filling it to a known point with water, inserting each mouthpiece and seeing how much the water raises will tell you the overall mass of the mouthpiece, or at least the difference between the two. While none of these measurements alone will give you a definitive answer about how a mouthpiece plays without trying it out, using them all in conjunction with each other will give you a better idea, and that can hopefully help you find the right fit for you.